Sunday, October 14th, 1945. A farmhouse kitchen near New Ulm, Minnesota. The air was thick, not with the jungle rot and cordite of Saipan, but with an alien, impossibly rich scent. Roasted beef, sweet carrots, and a heavy, dark shoyu, soy sauce, that was not soy sauce at all. It was gravy. Tomiko Hayashi gripped the coarse fabric of her issued work dress, her knuckles white. She sat at a polished wooden table, a heavy porcelain plate bearing a floral pattern set before her. The farmer, Mr. Olson, a man with hands like worn leather, bowed his massive head. His family mirrored him. The lone MP guard by the door, his M1911 sidearm holstered, awkwardly removed his cap. "Lord," the farmer's voice rumbled, "we thank you for this food and for these guests." Tomiko's eyes locked onto the steaming platter of pot roast. This was the enemy. This was the Oni, demon, from the propaganda posters. But the Oni was praying. Her mind fractured. This abundance, this ritual, this inexplicable gentleness. It was a weapon she had not been trained for, a kindness more disorienting than the violence. The stories they told were a lie. Or perhaps this was the most elaborate lie of all. 1 year earlier, the cliffs of Saipan. 1 year earlier, the cliffs of Saipan. The world was smoke and the screaming of metal. Tomiko Hayashi ran, her lungs burning with cordite, the cheap rubber soles of her tabi shoes slipping on the volcanic rock. She was no longer a nurse. She was an animal. Behind her, the chatter of a Type 99 machine gun went silent, replaced by the heavy, rhythmic thump, thump, thump of an American Browning. She clutched the Senninbari belt under her torn Mompe trousers. 1,000 stitches, 1,000 prayers for her protection, given by her mother. It had failed. She reached the edge of the cliff. Below, the Pacific Ocean churned a violent, indifferent blue. Beside her, other women, nurses, civilian workers, mothers clutching infants, were making the choice. The command was clear: Gyokusai, shattering the jewel. Better to die pure than to be captured by the Oni. A woman beside her, her face a mask of serene terror, bowed toward the rising sun and simply stepped off the edge. Tomiko squeezed her eyes shut, ready to follow. "Hey, you! Stop!" The voice was a guttural bark, alien and monstrous. She snapped her head around. He was huge, a giant in green-splotched frog-skin camouflage, his face painted green and black, his helmet netted. The demon. He raised his M1 Garand, the long rifle that had devoured her friends. This was it, the honorable death she had failed to take. She waited for the bullet. Instead, the Marine cursed, lowered the rifle, and took a step. He was young, his eyes wide with a strange mix of fury and exhaustion. He didn't shoot. He grabbed the shoulder of her blouse and shoved her, hard, away from the edge. "Get down! Get down the line!" Tomiko fell to her knees, the sharp rock, tearing her skin. She was alive. The demon had not killed her. He had not tortured her. He had saved her. This cognitive dissonance was a physical blow, a vacuum in her chest where her duty and her terror had lived. She was ashamed to be alive and terrified by the confusion. Another Marine shoved her from behind, herding her with a small, weeping group of civilians. She was tagged, dusted with a stinging white DDT powder, and forced toward a waiting transport. Her old world was gone, shattered on the rocks below. Her new one had begun with an act of inexplicable mercy. For weeks, the only world was the steel box. Tomiko sat on a hard wooden bench, the clack, 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 clack of the train wheels grinding into her bones. They were somewhere in America. The continent was an abstraction, an impossibly vast emptiness measured only by the changing quality of the light through the high barred windows. They were treated not with cruelty, but with a humiliating indifference. Twice a day, a guard would slide open the heavy door and pass in cardboard boxes labeled K-ration breakfast or supper. Inside was food that insulted the senses. A dense, oily block of cheese that tasted like soap, dry, hard biscuits, a tin of processed meat. It was here she met Emmy. Emmy was older, captured on Okinawa, and her cynicism was a hard shell. "It's poison," Emmy whispered fiercely on the third day, holding up the block of cheese. "They fatten us before the slaughter, or it makes us sterile. Do not eat it." Tomiko ate it anyway. The hunger was worse than the fear of the strange food. The language barrier was total. The guard's commands were harsh barks of sound, understood only through the gesture of a rifle barrel. Where were they going? A factory to build the bombs that killed their families? A re-education camp? The unknown festered, growing more terrifying than the memory of the Marines on Saipan. At least that terror had been honest. This slow, monotonous journey felt like a lie. Then, after an eternity, the train hissed, groaned, and stopped. The air brakes sighed. The heavy door slid open with a bang, flooding the car with blinding daylight. Tomiko shielded her eyes, expecting concrete walls, barbed wire, guard towers. There was nothing. She stepped down onto the gravel, her legs weak, and stared. It was flat. An ocean of green grass and black earth stretched to a horizon so distant it bent the sky. The air was clean, cool, and smelled of soil and wild onions. There were no factories, no prison walls, just a few low wooden barracks and a single farmhouse in the distance. This was America. This vast, silent emptiness was more intimidating than any fortress. The work began at dawn. The crop was sugar beets. The tools were heavy, long-handled hoes with wide steel heads designed for strong American arms. For Tomiko, whose hands were trained for the delicacy of bandages and needles, the weight was agonizing. They wore surplus U.S. Army work dresses, coarse blue denim that chafed their skin, stamped with PW on the back, though they were technically civilian internees. The distinction was lost on the guards and on the locals. The Minnesota sun was not the humid, oppressive heat of Saipan. It was a dry, relentless blaze. The black earth soaked it up, radiating it back at them. Tomiko focused on the rhythm. Swing the hoe, break the soil, thin the seedlings. Swing, break, thin. Her hands, soft from nursing school, were blistering by noon. By 3 o'clock, the blisters had broken, leaving raw, weeping skin. Emmy worked beside her, her face a mask of grim determination, never complaining, but her strokes were becoming erratic. The guards watched from the shade of a truck, smoking, indifferent. When they were marched past the Olson farmhouse for their midday water break, Tomiko saw a woman standing on the porch watching them. She was tall, blonde, and held a dish towel. This was Greta Olson. Her face was impossible to read, neither kind nor cruel, simply appraising. Tomiko quickly lowered her eyes, the feeling of being observed like an animal in a zoo adding to her humiliation. That evening, as they were herded back to the barracks, Tomiko's hands were bleeding freely. She tried to hide them, a sign of weakness. The next morning, marching back to the fields, she saw it. Left on the top rail of the fence, near the spot where she always started, was a pair of men's canvas work gloves. They were stiff, stained with oil and earth, but intact. Tomiko froze. Emmy hissed beside her, "A trick! They want to make us soft, to show we are weak." Tomiko glanced at the farmhouse. No one was watching. She looked at her raw palms. She thought of the heavy hoe handle, waiting for her. Shame burned her neck, but the physical pain was stronger. In one quick, guilty motion, she snatched the gloves and hid them in the folds of her denim dress. They were a test, a trap, a kindness. She didn't know which, but as she slipped them on, the coarse canvas protecting her skin, she felt a profound, confusing flicker of relief. The gloves were a secret pact of shame. Tomiko worked faster now, her hands protected, but her mind was frayed. She tried to focus on the earth, on the rhythmic bite of the steel, but her gaze kept drifting to the farmhouse. She was terrified of the woman on the porch, terrified of the next unspoken gesture. Emmy noticed Tomiko's protected hands and said nothing, but her silence was a cold judgment. The barrier between prisoner and captor was essential. It was a uniform of the mind. Kindness was a solvent that threatened to dissolve it. One hot afternoon, during a water break, it happened. A small boy, perhaps 6 years old, emerged from the farmhouse. He had white blonde hair and wore denim overalls, no shoes. This was Paulie, the Olsen's son. The guards, lax in the heat, paid him no mind. He approached the line of women, his steps hesitant, driven by a pure, uncomplicated curiosity. Emmy saw him first and hissed, a sharp intake of breath, recoiling as if from a snake. Abunai, dangerous. Tomiko froze. She remembered the training. All civilians were part of the war machine. Even a child could be a spy, a threat. But this child wasn't a threat. He was just a child. He stopped a few feet from Tomiko, his blue eyes wide. He was holding a small, crudely whittled bird. He fumbled with it, his shyness suddenly overwhelming him, and dropped it. The wooden bird landed in the dust near Tomiko's foot. The boy flushed, looked at the toy, then at Tomiko. He nudged it forward with his toe. Then, failing to find any words, he simply laughed. It was not a laugh of mockery. It was a high, clear, guileless sound. It was the sound of her younger brother, chasing a dragonfly in the garden in Nagasaki. It was a sound from before the war, from before the world had burned. The sound bypassed every layer of her indoctrination, every military protocol, and struck something deep and human. It hurt. It was the first normal sound she had heard in years, and it caused a painful, echoing crack in her defenses. She stared at the wooden bird, unable to move, unable to breathe. The wooden bird lay in the dust, untouched. Tomiko had forced herself to turn away, but the image of the boy's laugh remained, a sharp, painful splinter in her mind. The work felt heavier now. The routine she had built for protection, swing, break, thin, was fractured. The heat intensified as summer deepened. By July, the air was a thick, shimmering blanket. Sweat soaked through Tomiko's denim dress, pasting it to her back. The sun beat down relentlessly, and the black soil seemed to pull at her feet. She felt dizzy, spots dancing in front of her eyes. To collapse meant weakness. It meant failing in front of Emmy. It meant giving the indifferent guards a reason to notice her. She gripped the hoe, planting her feet, willing the faintness to pass. Then a shadow fell over her. Greta Olsen stood there, having walked quietly from the farmhouse. She carried a small wooden tray. On it were 2 tall glasses filled with white liquid, condensation beating on the glass. She had walked past the guard, who merely nodded. She held the tray out. Tomiko stared. Emmy beside her audibly recoiled. "Gyunyu," Emmy whispered, the word sharp with disgust. Milk. Tomiko's blood ran cold, a fear more primal than the Marines on Saipan. The propaganda films had been clear. The American Oni were giants, yes, but they subsisted on a diet of rich, sickening foods. Their milk, thick and oily, was poison to the Japanese stomach. It was a tool to make them weak, to corrupt their blood. Emmy took a step back, shaking her head violently and spitting on the ground. "Dame!" "No." Greta Olsen did not flinch. Her expression remained neutral. She simply held the tray steady, an offering. Tomiko's eyes were fixed on the beads of condensation. The coldness radiated from the glass. Her throat was sandpaper. The heat was crushing her. Was this a test of loyalty or an act of execution? Driven by a thirst so profound it eclipsed her training, Tomiko's hand moved. It trembled, but it moved. She wrapped her dirty fingers around the cold, wet glass. Emmy hissed her name, a warning, a condemnation. Tomiko raised the glass to her lips and drank. It was not poison. It was not oily or sickening. It was cold, impossibly cold, and sweet, and rich. It coated her dry throat, a shocking, profound nourishment. It was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. She drained the glass, the act feeling like a profound betrayal. She lowered it, breathing hard, and met Emmy's eyes. Emmy glared at her, her face a mask of contempt. Tomiko had failed the test. She had accepted the enemy's poison. The silence between Tomiko and Emmy grew as cold and vast as the Minnesota prairie. Tomiko drank the milk every day, a ritual of shame and survival. Emmy watched her, eyes narrowed, seeing not a compatriot, but a collaborator. The work in the beet fields continued, a monotonous rhythm that was the only constant in their lives. Then, in mid-August, the routine broke. They were working the far field when a jeep sped down the dirt track, skidding to a stop. Sergeant Rourke, the camp administrator, got out. He was a man they rarely saw, a man of clipboards and dispatches. "Line up," he barked, his voice unusually sharp. "At ease. Got news for you." The women formed a ragged line, hose resting on the ground. Tomiko's heart pounded. Had they done something wrong? Was the work unsatisfactory? Rourke pulled a piece of paper from his pocket and unfolded it, clearing his throat. He seemed annoyed, as if this was just another piece of paperwork. "As of 0900 hours today," he read, his voice flat, "the Japanese imperial government has agreed to unconditional surrender. The war is over." The words hung in the hot, dry air. Tomiko did not understand. Unconditional surrender? That was impossible. It was a phrase for cowards, for the weak. 2 new bombs were used, Rourke continued, glancing at the paper. The Emperor himself, broadcast his support for the terms. That was the word that broke them. The Emperor. Emmy let out a sound Tomiko had never heard, a low animal wail that tore from her chest. She collapsed, clutching the black earth, her body convulsing. The other women crumpled with her, not in relief, but in a collective, howling grief. Tomiko remained standing, frozen. The world had tilted off its axis. It wasn't just a military defeat. It was a spiritual annihilation, the Gyokuan Hoso, the sacred voice admitting defeat. It meant the cliffs of Saipan, the dead nurses, the Senninbari belt, all of it. It was for nothing. The propaganda was a lie. The sacrifice was a waste. She felt a horrifying, cavernous emptiness open up inside her, a void worse than the fear of the Oni, worse than the shame of the milk. It was the absolute, crushing weight of meaninglessness. The war was over, but they were still prisoners. The work continued, but its soul was gone. Before, the labor had been an act of defiance, a way to endure until victory. Now it was just labor, a punishment without a crime. The vibrant Minnesota autumn arrived, painting the landscape in defiant strokes of red and gold. The beauty felt like a mockery. Despair settled over the small group of women like the frost that now silvered the fields each morning. Emmy was the worst. She had stopped speaking. She moved like a ghost, and Tomiko saw her hiding her rations, pushing food away. Emmy, who had survived Okinawa, was now embracing a slow, quiet suicide in this place of impossible abundance. Tomiko watched her, terrified. This was the true enemy. Not the guards, not the Olsons, but the vast, crushing emptiness of a future that held nothing. One crisp morning in late September, Mr. Olson met them at the edge of the field. He did not point toward the beets. He spoke to the guard, then walked toward a section of the property near the main barn, gesturing for them to follow. A long, low stone wall, which separated the cattle pasture from the yard, had partially collapsed. Winter storms and spring thaws had scattered the heavy field stones. Olson didn't use words. He simply picked up a large, flat stone, hoisted it into place on the wall's foundation, and settled it. He looked at the women, then at the pile of stones. He was not ordering them to harvest. He was asking them to build. He left them. The guard watched, confused, but said nothing. For a moment, the women stood still. Then, Tomiko, her hands aching in the new cold, walked to the pile. She selected a stone. It was heavy, real. She carried it to the gap and fit it against the one Olson had placed. Emmy watched, her expression hollow. But after an hour, even Emmy bent, lifted a rock, and placed it. The work was brutal. It was heavier than hoeing, but it was different. It had a result. With every stone they lifted, the wall grew. They were not just digging. They were mending. They were creating order from chaos. Tomiko found a new rhythm, not of defiance, but of gaman, endurance. They were building a defense, not against the Olsons, but against the coming winter. Mr. Olson watched them from the barn, seeing not the enemy, but a small group of people trying to survive the cold. The wall was almost finished. It was mid-October, and the air had a sharp, metallic bite. The women worked with a focused, silent energy, the rhythm of lifting and placing stones a meditation against the cold. Tomiko felt a sliver of pride, a dangerous, confusing emotion as she looked at the solid structure they had built. It was real. As they finished for the day, stacking their tools, Mr. Olson approached. He was not carrying gloves or tools. He stopped a few feet away, holding his worn felt hat in his hands. The guard, leaning against the jeep, watched with mild curiosity. Mr. Olson looked at Tomiko, then at Amy, who stood rigid, her face blank. "Sunday," he said, his voice slow and clear, as if speaking to a child. 1 o'clock. My house. For dinner." He nodded toward the farmhouse, a thin curl of smoke rising from its chimney. "Pot roast." Tomiko stared, not understanding the words pot roast, but understanding the gesture, an invitation, to his house, to sit at his table. Panic seized her. This was worse than the milk. This was not an impersonal offering. It was a social command. To accept was to fraternize, to become a guest, to betray every soldier who had died fighting this man's army, to refuse. He was their captor. He was the man who requisitioned their labor. Refusing a captor was dangerous. Emmy understood. She made a sharp, disgusted sound in her throat and spat on the ground near Olson's boot. Tomiko felt the blood rush to her face. She bowed her head, her hands twisting in her denim dress. "No, thank you," she managed, the English words feeling thick and wrong in her mouth. "Busy, work, busy." Mr. Olson looked at the ground where Emmy had spat. His face, weathered by decades of sun and wind, was unreadable. He showed no anger, no offense. He simply put his hat back on, his expression unchanged. "We'll expect you at 1, he said, not as a request, but as a statement of fact. He turned and walked back to the house. Tomiko watched him go, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was not an invitation. It was an order, delivered with the impenetrable, quiet authority of the landscape itself. It was an act of softness that felt aggressive, a kindness that left her trapped. Panic propelled them. As soon as they were dismissed, Tomiko and Emmy marched directly to the small camp office, a wooden shack where Sergeant Rourke managed the logistics of their captivity. This was their only recourse. The military was the wall between them and the civilians. Rourke was on the phone, his boots propped up on his desk, a cigarette dangling from his lips. He looked up, annoyed as they entered, and waved them impatiently toward two chairs. Tomiko remained standing, rigid. When he finally slammed the phone down, he sighed. What? Emmy surprisingly spoke first. She had been hoarding scraps of English. Olsen farm, house, Sunday, no. She shook her head, her face tight with a lifetime of defiance. Tomiko added, her voice barely a whisper. No. Please. Protocol? No fraternization. She used the formal word, fraternization, hoping it would trigger a rule, a regulation that would protect them. Rourke stared at them. He wasn't a cruel man. He was a tired man. The war was over. He was no longer a combat NCO. He was a glorified babysitter for prisoners, farmers, and paperwork. This was just more paperwork. He rubbed his face, the sound of his stubble rasping. Look, he said, his voice devoid of emotion. The war is over. The rules, he said, the word like it tasted bad, are different. Olsen's a good man. He's not trying to whatever. It's a goodwill gesture. It's for his wife. No, Emmy said again, a single hard syllable. Rourke's patience snapped. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly. He was not Mr. Olsen. He was the U.S. Army. You don't get it, do you? He snapped. This isn't a request. It's a local incident I don't want to deal with. So, you will go. You will sit there. You will eat whatever the hell they put in front of you, and you will not cause trouble. It's an order. The finality of it hit Tomiko like a physical blow. Trapped. They were not being protected by the military. They were being ordered by the military to participate in an intimate civilian ritual. The lines had blurred completely. The military and the farmer were one and all, and she was trapped between them. Sunday arrived. The sky was a bright, cold blue. Rourke pulled up in his Jeep at 1:45. He didn't speak. They got in. He drove the short distance to the farmhouse and stopped at the gate. Go, he said. They got out. They walked up the path to the wooden porch. They stood before the door. Tomiko raised a trembling hand and knocked. The sound was too loud in the cold, still air. The door opened. It was not Mr. Olsen, but Greta. She wore a simple house dress and a cotton apron, her face slightly flushed from the heat of the kitchen. She did not smile. She simply held the door open and nodded for them to enter. Tomiko stepped across the threshold. Emmy followed, her body rigid, as if walking into an execution. The first blow was the warmth. It was a dense, physical wave of heat from a wood-fired stove, a profound comfort so deep it felt like an attack. The barracks were always cold. The second blow was the smell. It was not the scent of the beets or the K-rations or the damp wool of their blankets. It was an alien, impossibly rich scent. Roasted beef, sweet carrots, onion, and a heavy dark shoyu, soy sauce, that was not soy sauce at all. It was gravy. Tomiko's senses were overwhelmed. She wanted to bolt. This was not a house. It was a weapon. The small living room was clean, filled with polished dark wood, handmade doilies, and framed photographs of people she did not know. The little boy, Paulie, peeked at them from behind his father's chair before being shooed away. They were directed to the dining table. It was polished wood, set for a family. The guard Rourke stood awkwardly by the door, his M1911 sidearm holstered, having refused a seat. Tomiko sat. In front of her was a heavy porcelain plate bearing a floral pattern. It was a shock, after a year of eating from a battered aluminum mess kit. Then Greta Olsen emerged from the kitchen carrying a large, steaming platter. Tomiko stopped breathing. It was meat, a mountain of dark, roasted beef, glistening with fat, surrounded by soft-cooked vegetables. Image from Cold Open. The steaming roast on the floral porcelain. This was not the thin, fish and rice austerity of wartime Japan. This was an amount of meat she had not seen in 5 years. It was the wealth of a daimyo, feudal lord, sitting on a farmer's Sunday table. This abundance was a violence. It was an assault. It was an irrefutable physical testament that everything she had been taught, every propaganda film about the starving, desperate enemy, was a lie. The Oni did not just live in warm houses. They ate like kings. The cognitive dissonance was so profound it made her physically nauseous. Mr. Olson sat at the head of the table. He looked at the food, then at his guests. He cleared his throat and bowed his head. The family mirrored him, heads bowed. Tomiko and Emmy remained rigid, upright. It was an agonizing, exposed silence. "Lord," Mr. Olson's voice rumbled, low and certain, "we thank you for this food and for the hands that helped raise it. We thank you for this harvest and for these guests." The pause was a chasm. Guests. Not prisoners. Not Japs. Guests. The word hung in the air, as alien and heavy as the smell of the roast. Amen. The family raised their heads. The silence that followed was even louder. Emmy was trembling, her knuckles white on her knees, her face a mask of furious, profound insult. Tomiko was paralyzed, her mind fractured. She was waiting for the next part of the ritual, the lecture, the speech about democracy, or Jesus, or the righteousness of the American victory. She braced for the final humiliation. Mr. Olson picked up his napkin, cleared his throat, and looked not at them, but at a point on the table between them. "Air's got a bite," he said, his voice quiet. "Winter's coming. Always a hard time." Tomiko did not respond. "My grandfather," Olson continued, his gaze distant, "he came over from Sweden, 1881. He used to tell me about the blizzard of 88. Caught him on the prairie, walking back from town. No trees, no shelter, just white. Said he burrowed into a snowdrift next to his ox, and he stayed there for 2 days. He ate the raw grain he'd been carrying in his pocket." He paused, looking at his own hands, calloused and thick. He said the cold was a clean enemy. It didn't hate him. It was just big. And he had to be stronger than it. He just had to endure. Tomiko's breath caught. He was not lecturing. He was not preaching. He was telling a story. It was a story she understood. He was speaking of gaman. He was speaking of Saipan. He was speaking of the beet fields. He was not talking about war or surrender or God. He was talking about winter. He was talking about survival. The story finished. The unbearable tension in the room had not vanished, but it had changed. It had focused. Greta Olson stood. She picked up the heavy silver serving spoon and fork. She held the platter of steaming pot roast, and she offered it, not to her husband, but to Tomiko. The platter steamed. Greta Olson held it out, her arm steady. It was an offering, neutral and patient. This was the final barrier. This was the true surrender. To accept the milk was a secret shame. To accept this, to sit at their table, to eat their food, to participate in their ritual, was a public acknowledgement. It was to accept their shared humanity. Tomiko could feel Emmy's stare, hot and sharp, boring into the side of her head. Emmy's gaze was the cliffs of Saipan. It was the wailing for the emperor. It was the past, demanding loyalty. But Mr. Olson's story was in the room too, a story not of war, but of winter. Tomiko looked at the meat. It was just food. She was just hungry. Slowly, her hands trembling, she picked up the heavy porcelain plate. She held it out. Mrs. Olson's expression did not change, but Tomiko saw her shoulders relax just slightly. She used the large fork and spoon to serve Tomiko a thick slice of the pot roast, several soft carrots, and a roasted potato. Then She picked up the gravy boat and spooned the thick brown alien sauce over everything. The plate was heavy. Tomiko set it down. She looked at the heavy silver fork, so different from mohashi, chopsticks. She picked it up. It felt clumsy, a weapon, not an utensil. She cut a small piece of the meat. She lifted it. Emmy let out a tiny, choked sound, a gasp of final betrayal. Tomiko put the fork in her mouth. It was not poison. It was not a trick. It was warm. It was salty and impossibly rich with fat. It was a sensory shock, overwhelming and savory. It was just food. She swallowed. The warmth spread from her chest outward. It was the first warm meal she'd had in a year. She cut another piece. She ate the carrot, which melted in her mouth, sweet and earthy. She ate. Emmy stared at the table, her plate empty. When Mrs. Olson offered her the platter, Emmy shook her head, a single, violent negative. The bond was broken. Tomiko finished what was on her plate. She placed the heavy fork down. She looked across the table at Mr. Olson, who was watching her, his face no longer unreadable, but just tired. He had told his story. She had eaten his food. Tomiko bowed her head slightly, not in the deep, formal bow of submission, but in a small gesture of acknowledgement. "Arigato," she whispered. "Thank you."